And we're going to go ahead and go to shared screen. And everybody, thanks again for being here, guys. Good to have you here. I want to talk about some concepts that are pretty essential. So one thing, I might take notes on this if you want. I mean, feel free not to as well. But DD is a really good acronym to memorize for academic writing. And it's easy because we think of Dunkin' Donuts logo, and that's why I went with this. And we could come up with a couple other phrases or ways to put it, but the idea is to define and differentiate, and to do so very early in the academic work that you're writing. So a basic formula for two essential moves in most academic or scholarly writing is DD, and we define the main concept and issue as it's established, as it is currently understood by a significant group of the population or a significant group of scholars within your field. But then you do that second move, you differentiate. You have to do a spin move off of that, right? So what's your spin move? How do you get around and kind of take it to the hole, so to speak, all you hoopers? How do we differentiate? How do we stand out? And that is really a key move in taking the original definition and slightly challenging it, or slightly saying, again, I agree in part, or I think here's another additional aspect that needs to be considered, or here's a gap that has not been considered. So those are all essentials. Let's look at ways to differentiate. This is basically a review slide of the slide you folks have had. In your introduction, you may want to use one or more of the following moves. Again, state how you plan to define the term. So start with a different term, and then, if you will, give a 1 or 2 sentence launching statement that focuses your audience to know how you plan to go forward in redefining that term or differentiating slightly from the way it's been defined. A second move is to use some kind of qualification phrase, which is like although, nonetheless. And this allows you, again, to push off a misperception. So again, we're doing the DD move. We're defining, differentiating. So although blank believes this, nonetheless, we need to explore blank, or we need to uncover something that's been hidden in that classic definition. The third is to kind of narrow, and we can narrow our terms. At this point, a lot of you need to do so, and I'm suggesting that in your source notes. We might narrow our particular argument to an audience or group. You know, in the case of some of your topics, you might narrow by location. So where are the hot spots? So for example, if we're looking at paying college athletes, we might narrow to a particular group, meaning the athletes themselves, and how they might be paid. We might look at a location of where now it's trending as to new rules coming in, looking at Florida and California with their new rules. We might simply focus the paper whole or in part on those more narrow aspects. So this was actually from one of my student papers. Originally, the statement that one of the students came up with, or this student came up with, is, I will argue that light pollution is as important as air pollution. And it's a pretty cool idea already. You're like, wow, light pollution, I had not considered that. So already there's a slight differentiation there that's implied, but we want to push it a little further. So you could say, instead, light pollution adversely affects animals, especially bats, a caution for all national parks. And you can see immediately in that phrase, we've now got a statement of effect, right? It adversely affects. There's more of a flex there, if you will, more of an opinion. And now we have a specific group that it's affecting, right? Light pollution's affecting animals. Let's get even more specific. It affects especially bats. And then what is the implication? Why should I care? Oh, it's a caution for all national parks. Oh, I might care about national parks. So trying to get into that differentiation phrase, not only a narrowing of subject, but also that move to kind of make me, as an audience, feel you're answering the question, why? Why should I care? It's not to be caustic, but even in academic work, we have to answer the question why pretty quickly, because otherwise people push away from the essay and say, meh, I don't care. So if we're just defining terms, people are going to simply ask by page 2, why are you telling me this? You have to argue that even back to your prof and back to maybe as you get to graduate school, toward other scholars and toward other academics that would read your work. Again, I'll take questions on this, but I'm just going to go through that one more slide here. Is your purpose more so to argue, describe, analyze, or explain? And this is important to use these terms early so that your audience is also cued. So I would probably lean toward actually using these verbs in your work. In this essay, I plan to analyze blank. Most times, 9 out of 10 times, you're still going to use that word argue. And it's a soft word in academia. It doesn't mean I'm going to punch it in the face and just say it's trash. It means I'm going to differentiate. I'm going to explain how there's a gap. I'm going to say there's something worthy to position forward. So argument is persuasion with a bit of sort of a confident positioning of new data, new consideration. Yeah, analyze, describe, or explain just means that sometimes you're simply getting a lot of your essay just simply laying out the lay of the land. You know, here are the positions. And so sometimes you are describing the case or explaining it before you can argue or analyze. And so sometimes these verbs even go in sequence. If you're going to describe, and for me, for this essay, I am going to say, hey, I'm going to still need you to step into some kind of argument, some kind of position where you're flexing an opinion and differentiating slightly. All right, so here's an example. My purpose is to argue that contraceptives aren't just for preventing pregnancies, but they help with a host of other health issues. Now that one still, technically by our last statement that we revised, is a little bit vague, like a host of other health issues, like what? And I do want to say this to you guys. Sometimes that opening focusing statement can be so narrow and so tight and so thesis driven, like high school. You know, you're giving 3 different ways. My purpose is to argue contraceptives aren't just for preventing pregnancies, but they help with regulation of hormones, da 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 da. You give your 3 points, and then you follow 1, 2, 3 in your body paragraphs, right? It's called a forecasting thesis statement. That's totally cool, and that's totally clear, and it totally works. On the flip side is sometimes we want to be more subtle, and sometimes we want to give ourselves room to kind of lead people into it, you know, create a little bit of mystique. And it's okay to take a different approach where you're slightly holding back in definition initially. Um, I say slightly because if it's too vague and it's too broad, then we're going to be like, I'm still not getting why you're telling me this. So here I've got clearly my purpose is, right, to argue that, and I've got clearly the subject contraceptives aren't just for preventing pregnancies. I have a differentiating move there, right? They aren't just for, they help with other health issues. The health issues is a little big, but I know that I'm going to probably, you know, if as I'm reading say, oh, okay, well then tell me, or you've intrigued me enough that I'll go along for the ride for you to define it later. Okay, last but not least, we're going to pose a question often with qualifiers. The example is, to what extent do people need access to affordable contraceptives for health issues other than preventing pregnancies? So we take the same question, we're posing it slightly more tangential, meaning more, it's coming in by proxy through a question. And questions are risky. We were told in high school probably not to use them in thesis statements or in introductions, but many academics do use them. They're used sparingly, meaning they're not still the preeminent form of articulating an opinion within an introduction. But here it's a tease, and it's implied there is a little bit of a rhetorical gambit. You know, you've heard of a rhetorical question kind of implying the answer that's wanted or implying the answer that will be pursued. So we see here, to what extent do people need access to affordable contraceptives? Obviously the topic's there. Obviously need is implied as a word that's going to be weighed. You know, how much, to what extent? Here the question works really because it's qualified, right? To what extent? Okay, I'm going to run this one and then we're done, but let's run quickly because these are probably ones that we might come back to just as ways to say, okay, how do I do this, or how do I actually pencil this in? And these are actual statements that you can use and slightly change. So you can differentiate and push for implications. You can answer those questions, why and so what, and why should I care, that your audience has. And these templates can have help, and you could use one of these possibly, or bridge it, or use none of them. Okay, I never want to force and or prescribe like, oh, this is the almighty gift. No, we're, to given the circumstance, we're going to use or not use them. Most of you won't use them, and that's fine, because it's going to be almost too wooden, like you're like, ah, I feel in a box. But some of you might use them as teasing, what I mean by teasing is just to get yourself writing. You might feel like, oh God, I hate writing essays, I hate starting them. This might be a way to help you start, and then you can push away from it, meaning you just drop it. It doesn't end up being in your final essay. But the first one is a key term from both that both X and Y bring up is blank. This allows you to do two things right up front. It allows you to define the term, but then it also allows you to bring in two different viewpoints that are established. So again, you're defining the term as defined by two scholars or two experts, and then pushing away from it. So X defines it as blank, Y defines it as blank, and then obviously you're going to come in with refereeing that, right? Which one do you agree with more, or do you have a third definition? Again, although nonetheless, it's a great one to go back to because it just pushes you to differentiation. Third one is, my question is blank. This question is important because, or this question implies. Sometimes just being flat out with your terms, just saying it's important. It implies. Those are really helpful structures. They're just very clear. They're bell ringers. We all know where you're going. We all know what you're saying. It's not bad to be extremely explicit in academic writing. And then on the other hand, again, common sense. This isn't, something that's interstellar. This is just good logic, right? I'm going to differentiate. I've got one side, I've got another side. Academic writing does deal with a lot of binaries, meaning a lot of oppositional ideas or constructs, and sometimes that's weak. It's a holdover in academic logic from the Greeks, which isn't bad, but we are looking for hopefully coming with a third or implying a little bit more how there's differentiation, not so easily deposited in pro-con or right-left positions. All right, this one's good, and I will break this down probably in another lecture. It's called a problem solution format, and it comes from the emeritus professor of writing at the University of Chicago, Joe Harris. And it's a really cool idea, I think, because it just says that I'm going to frame the belief that my solution challenges. And here it goes. There seems to be a gap with blank. So there seems to be a gap with people thinking the pollution only as what comes out of a pipe. Well, that doesn't even work in this case, but there seems to be a gap with pollution being only defined as, as air pollution, what comes out of a pipe, I guess. And then you go on to say, so what, and emphasize the cost. Many people believe that this is the primary pollution we must fight. Indeed, it's important. However, there's a gap, and that is we ignore light pollution. As a consequence, we pay for this in obliterating our ability to not only see the sky, but derive XYZ kinds of science from studies of the universe, or astronomy and so on. Or animals, of course, are not able to breed, or because of light pollution are disoriented. So anyway, that's a way to break into three parts. You can see there, the first is the statement of the belief, if you will, the current way to look at things. And again, then there's a so what, you march out that belief as it is, and then you say, well, the problem is if we keep going here, as a consequence, we're going to either lose time, money, health, educational opportunities. So you really kind of ant bridge up those elements. You can say nobody wants to lose time, nobody wants to lose money, nobody wants to lose health. And if you can get those three and game them in as a consequence, and do so fairly early in the essay, it can be a very convincing way to get your audience engaged. Now, as to whether you state all your solutions up front, that can also vary, but just an idea. Okay, that's it, guys. Thanks for hanging in here. I'm going to go ahead and dump out of that recording.